Chiefers, what is up? You guys are in for a treat today. We've kind of talked a lot about MTHFR over the years, as it was something that Stace was suffering from, and what we had to do was actually figure out how to deal with her MTHFR and how we could use different supplements to actually make her really thrive in life rather than crash and burn like she was at times of her life. And we kind of delve deep into it over many podcasts, but this podcast is an insight to it all and what's going on. And maybe you might be able to see some of the certain things that are going on or that can typically come up when you've got these SNPs of the MTHFR gene, as to they might relate to your life, and you might say, whoa, hold up, that's something that I see, or that's something that's very typical of me. And in that case, then this podcast is going to be great for you because it kind of tells you a whole heap of different things that you can do just naturally to help you out. But at the end of the podcast, Chris Masterjohn actually offers you guys a little 20% discount on his testing nutritional statuses, the ultimate cheat sheet. And the ultimate cheat sheet is something that he's created, and it's kind of like how you can turbocharge your nutrition and upgrade your whole body. It's kind of like how you dig into any nutritional deficiencies that you might have and any imbalances in your system, and kind of figuring out what they are. But then it also gives you recipes to restore your well-being and slash risks of degenerative disease. It doesn't cure disease, but it can help you from getting, like, I guess, curing yourself from, say, for instance, if you were to get, or if you were prone to getting arthritis, you might be able to stop yourself from getting that, or you're definitely very able to stop yourself from getting that. And this little sheet, all you need to do is go across to the website, which is chrismasterjohn.com/Chief Life, the Chief Life, and on that one you just need to use the code Chief Life, which is all in capitals, Chief Life. So you can head across to his website, even if you don't go to the Chief Life, and you can go straight to his website and just go straight and use the code Chief Life, all in capitals. It's also in the show notes. You guys can check out the show notes, and you'll be able to see exactly where you need to click into so you can purchase this one. So instead of it being $30, which is ridiculous, $30, you'll instead get it for $24, which is an awesome discount, awesome deal. $24 for a guide that might be able to help you out, or that will definitely help you out with your long-term health. So if that's something that interests you, please head across. Otherwise, I hope you thoroughly enjoy this episode. Guys, welcome back to the Chief Life Podcast. I am Matthias Turner, joined by co-host Stacey Lee Turner.
Hey guys.
She's actually come out of retirement for this one. She's so excited. But
I'm currently on maternity leave, but yeah, that's all good.
So we've got Chris Masterjohn with us. Chris, welcome, mate.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, I mean, we actually came across some of your stuff. I think we came across it in different realms ourselves. Stace was diagnosed with like MTHFR and
gene mutations.
Yeah, gene mutations a while ago, and it kind of started this whole route for us, and it allowed us to start helping other people. But someone that we found along the way in our own separate paths was yourself, Chris, because of all the work that you've done around it. And I believe that you are, to some extent, like a specialist within methylation.
It's definitely one of my interests.
Mm-hmm. Is it because that you'd had issues with it before yourself?
Well, so I mean, my personal experience has, before I went into nutrition. So I have a PhD in nutritional sciences. I was assistant professor of tenure track full-time faculty, trying to go the academic route for a while, and before I do what I do now, which is just produce nutrition content for out of my apartment, basically, for the internet. And what led me ultimately to that was largely trying to explain why I went like borderline psychotic when I was a vegan, and why my mental health completely turned around in a revolutionary way when I started focusing on nutrient-dense animal foods. And so So methylation is one of the primary candidates that I would think about, both because methylation, not that it's all about mental health, but it certainly has a powerful impact on mental health.
Yeah.
And although folate is a major nutrient that supports methylation found in plant foods, several other components of the methylation system are overwhelmingly found in animal food. So vitamin B12 is the most obvious one. Vitamin B12 is in fact, folate can't do anything to support methylation without vitamin B12. And although you can get plenty of folate on a vegan diet, you're not going to get any B12 unless you supplement. So that's one thing. And then choline is definitely found in plant foods, and it is possible to get enough choline on a vegan diet, but it's sort of like easier if you eat a lot of eggs. And so that's relevant also. And then even some of the nutrients that are more in the background in methylation, like thiamine, niacin, and riboflavin, don't get as central attention in methylation, but they're still in the background making it happen. And riboflavin in particular is way easier to get a lot of on a nutrient-dense animal-based diet than it is on a vegan diet. And so and then also yeah, I'll leave it at that. So
cool. No,
methylation would be a good candidate to try to explain what happened to me. But also I just love any kind of systems analysis, and the methylation system is a great one to kind of study. How does this thing work with all its interacting parts?
Yeah. And so for you started off on a vegan diet for health reasons. Like that was something that you wanted to make as a health conscious choice, or was it more of an ethical choice that you wanted to do it?
It was the triad of health, environmentalism, and animal rights.
And when you started getting sick, was it ever the thought like, hey, this is because of my diet, or did it take a while before you got to that stage?
I don't no, not really. So I think there were a couple things happening at once. So one was I was dealing with the issue philosophically. I have this thing that's embedded in my personality where I feel like ethics should be sort of permanent features of the world, and so it was always kind of in the back of my mind that if it was so hard to get B12 on a vegan diet, there might be something wrong with the ethics of not being able to use animal products. So that was kind of in the background that was bothering me, even though I think you could easily make an argument against that. Like, why shouldn't you change your ethics as time goes on according to circumstance? But that's not how I think. So that was one thing. Then another thing was I was getting very deep cravings for red meat. So that was happening.
Yeah.
And then I my health was definitely falling apart, but I wasn't connecting it to any of those things. In fact, it was really kind of a coincidence that my teeth had also fallen apart. I went into the dentist and I needed over a dozen cavities and needed 2 root canals. And that happened around the same time that my boss, I was an undergraduate and I was working in the dining hall on campus. My boss gave me a pamphlet that talked about the work of Weston Price, who was a pioneer in nutritional anthropology, but he got his start as a dental researcher. And so he was particularly writing about the impact of nutritional anthropology on dental anthropology. And he's talking about people who are free of tooth decay. And I was like, I want freedom from tooth decay. Where do I get that? And so that's when I read Weston Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, from 1939/1945. And I was trying to fix my teeth. Even at that point, I didn't think that my mental health falling apart had anything to do with my food. Even though Price touches on mental health a little bit, it's not a focus of his. And so it just kind of happened by accident that I cured my mental health problems when I was trying to fix my teeth.
That's awesome. And you
so I really wasn't making those connections until post hoc after the fact.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, you completed your nutritional sciences PhD in 2012, and this was all happening as an undergrad. So was this experience that you started to go through as an undergrad guiding you to work in the nutritional sciences field, or was that something you already had an interest in your postgrad?
I my bachelor's degree is in history. And I wanted to be a high school social studies teacher. And so this was all happening in my 4th senior year of college, and then I was a super senior after that. So it was around, actually, maybe, I can't remember. It took me 5 years to finish my bachelor degree because I changed my major like 20 times. And it was in the 4th or 5th year that was all happening. And then I decided I had to finish the degree. And then as soon as I did that, I wanted to go to medical school. But to go to medical, which I never did, but to go to medical school, I would have needed all the science undergraduate prereqs that you put in like a pre-med program. I didn't have any of those because my bachelor's was in history. Mm-hmm. So I had to do a lot of undergrad science classes. I started that the summer that I left. The summer that after I graduated. And while I was doing that, there were multiple things that happened that made me go into research instead of medicine. Mm-hmm. But also like I was like full time for a year and a half, and then I ran into some financial trouble before I finished up the classes that I had. So I was working in a concrete plant, and then I was working as a teacher of remedial math at a federally funded institution called Job Corps for people who didn't have a high school degree who wanted to learn a trade, get their driver's license, and get their GED. Yeah. So I was like kind of off track for a while. Yeah. then I finished up my classes and started. So it was like I think I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2003, if I remember correctly, and it was 2008 by the time that I got into graduate school because of all the little bumps.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that almost has set you up for success, though, because you had to go and teach people things that maybe they might not have wanted to learn that much. Like it's something that, hey, they had an understanding of, hey, I need to do this maths, but I don't necessarily want to do it. I just need to do it for my role. And so maybe that set you up for success for being able to, I guess, put it in layman's terms for the things that you're trying to
do now.
Yeah, exactly. Discuss and explain, and I feel like you do a good job with nutrition.
That's an interesting hypothesis, but I was teaching people like whole number addition and subtraction.
Okay.
And I don't put anything into that layman's terms. So,
it worked at the time.
It sounded good.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about what it was like going from doing your PhD, which I'm assuming was in human nutritional studies, but then you went and worked in a veterinary college for a while. So what was that like?
Yeah, I actually took care of a lot of rats during my time. My doctoral studies were a combination of rat experiments and the analysis of a human study that someone else did. Mm-hmm. So I actually I assisted some people in doing human studies. Like I like mixed things into milk for like hidden treatments and stuff for other people's studies. But I didn't direct a human study of my own. And so there is, in my dissertation, there is a paper on a human study, but it was like some guy in our lab did the human study and then quit. And then my lab mate took it over, and then I took over this side project from the blood samples in that human study. Excuse me. But at the veterinary college, the thing that was hard, there's no comparison, right? Because I wasn't teaching that much when I was undergrad. I taught like a food science lab, but that was kind of a joke in terms of teaching. And at the veterinary college, I was teaching 8 lectures on vitamins and minerals to the first year veterinary students. And so that was really my first like university level actual class lecture teaching gig. And what was hard about that was that I felt the need to get a lot of animal case studies to make the stuff really relevant to them. And I would sit in the back of the guy before, the guy who taught before me was teaching renal physiology, and I'd sit in the back of his lecture for the last 20 minutes sometimes, and he didn't do that at all. He'd be like, these are the normal levels of creatinine, and someone's like, yeah, but what is that in dogs? And he's like, I don't know. So they just borrowed him from the human medicine school, but so I'm kind of an overachiever in that regard. But yeah, but I was just doing rat studies there, like I was before. So
and so, I mean, diving a little bit deeper into MTHFR, it is a gene that we that's all right. I'll give you a sec. So, I mean, could we dive a little bit deeper into it? I guess what is MTHFR and why can, I guess, we be affected by it so much?
Well, maybe a better question to start with when you can breathe again is what is methylation? Because then we can talk about the genes that affect that system.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
How long do you have?
So feel free to like turn up or down the level of detail, but methylation is a process that uses B vitamins and choline, which is B vitamin like, as well as several amino acids, which are the components of protein to support your mental and physical health. The most important health outcomes that are very impacted by changes in methylation status are the synthesis of creatine, which a lot of people who are athletes take to improve strength and performance, but which also has many other important roles in the body. It's been shown, for example, that the amount of creatine that athletes take to support performance also helps with depression in women. And we also know that creatine is needed to help us see and hear. It's needed to help our skin regenerate. It's needed to provide the energy to pump stomach acid. It's needed to our sperm use creatine to power their way up the vaginal canal when they're trying to find the egg. All kinds of things like that are creatine dependent. So mental and physical energy and mental health are all dependent on creatine. It's pretty impactful for liver health. In particular, it's used to synthesize phosphatidylcholine, which is needed to remove fat from the liver. So if you don't have enough, you get fatty liver. And it's also needed to provide bile, and bile is what helps you digest fats and absorb fat-soluble nutrients. Out of those, phosphatidylcholine tends to be pretty stable, and so creatine is more likely to be impacted by your nutritional support for methylation. Dopamine and histamine are both metabolized with methylation in a way that basically means more methylation, because of effects on dopamine, helps make your mind more mentally fluid and more mentally flexible. Less methylation helps make it more stable. Personality types can depend in part on just small variations in how flexible versus stable your mind is. So for example, if your mind is more flexible, you're probably open to newer ideas. You're probably able to switch tasks. So for example, executive functions where you have 100 tasks to manage, a very flexible mind is very good for that, because you do one task, you finish it, you go on, help someone with something else. Whereas if you're doing deep creative and analytical work where you really have to stick with something for hours on end, you really want a more mentally stable, a more stable mind. But then there's also pathological outcomes on either side. So hyperdistractibility, as in the case of ADHD, would be on one end, and intense rumination and the inability to let anything go would be on the other end. OCD would be a great example of that. And OCD and on one hand, and ADHD and impulse disorders on the other hand are most closely tied with those states, but also depression and anxiety can fit in as well. So for example, if your mind's very mentally stable, it might be really productive if you essentially become obsessed with work or school, but it might be very unproductive, if you're becoming ruminating or obsessing about why everyone hates you or some other kind of negative thing with negative emotional tone to it. So more methylation is going to allow you to get more mental flexibility and is basically going to pull you out of that pathologically ruminating end. And then there's also, you could also over methylate. And so over methylation can tip you into the distractible end. And there's important buffers in the methylation system that prevent you from going in either extreme. So wanting methyl support and also wanting the buffers of that are important. Histamine is best known for causing allergic reactions, but antihistamines can knock you out sometimes. So for example, Benadryl can put you to sleep, and that's because in the brain, histamine plays an important role in alertness, and the hyper alert state can be an anxiety producing, panic inducing state. So enough histamine is important in the brain to keep you awake, but too much histamine in the brain because of not enough methylation could contribute to anxiety and could contribute to panic attack. And then there are many other things that are tied to methylation, but they tend to be not as sensitive as those. So for example, we regulate our genetic expression all the time. Like we have a gene that codes for a certain protein, and we say, how much of this protein do I want? Well, I want less or more of it in this certain circumstance. And so we alter our genetic expression all the time, with methylation being a primary way we do that. But the methylation of genes tends to not be very sensitive to the incoming pool of methyl donors from the nutrients that you're eating. So it can be impacted by methylation, but usually it's not. Usually it's those other things I was just talking about that are most likely to suffer.
So
and then
and
whenever you want, we can talk about MTHFR.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so obviously that's when things are working, but they can be kind of turned up or turned down based on what you're eating, what supplements you're taking, all that sort of stuff. Environmental factors, toxins, so on and so forth.
Goes on,
So that's like good scenario. Then when somebody has a genetic mutation in one of the genes that affect methylation, and MTHFR is the one that gets the most attention, obviously there's others. Why do you think that it's become so much more prevalent that we're talking about MTHFR? Is it because it's more common now due to environmental factors and toxins, or is it because we've just got more awareness around it?
It's definitely because we've got more awareness around it. And one of the things that you can see in the, and I really would not say, I wouldn't talk about MTHFR as a diagnosis because it's not a disease. There are extremely rare, extremely severe defects in MTHFR that do cause like a rare genetic disease, but that's not what we're all talking about, right?
No.
So what there really is just a big spread of MTHFR activity in the population. And in fact, the two common variants that people look at, A1298C and C677T, these two, basically you could have 6 combinations of not having either, having both of one, having both of the other, having the two combined. And one is a weaker decrease than the other. So basically, if you plot out, you can plot out MTHFR activity based on not having one of those, having two of the worst one on the opposite end, and the other 4 combinations in between. And it almost works out to like 15%-ish of people are in each category. It's a very even spread of MTHFR activity.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked at research on when they came about. You can make, I mean, people who do that kind of research can make statistical inferences about how old the polymorphisms are, and I haven't looked at that, but it has to be the case that they're pretty old, because they're pretty evenly spread across most populations that have been measured. So they're definitely not something that just came about 10 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it's possible. There's 2 possible ways to think about why they're so common. One would be that there's been some kind of selective pressure to spread them, and that means that there was a benefit that because there was a benefit, people who had them reproduced more. And researchers who do that kind of research can also use math to determine that. I doubt that's the case, but if it were the case, you could posit that what we were just talking about, that MTHFR is going to influence your methylation of dopamine, and so it's going to affect the balance between mental stability and flexibility. And there certainly is a trade-off between those two traits, and it certainly is desirable to have a spread of that personality trait in the population. So you could posit that, but I don't favor that view, because MTHFR influences that, but it's not directly influencing it. It's really indirectly influencing it, and it's doing so many other things.
Yeah.
Most of which are pretty bad in terms of like, if you look outside that personality trait thing, you're basically looking at like increased risk of fatty liver disease, increased risk of bile problems. There's outside of that mental trait thing, there's not that much that's a trade-off. It's really sort of like appears largely negative. Yeah. So there's another thing that I think is very interesting, which is that I think it's probably the case that they're so common because they didn't actually matter until our diets became what they are now. So one of the interesting pieces of the puzzle is that in the C677T polymorphism, which is the variant that reduces MTHFR activity the most, on a mechanistic basis, meaning why does it happen? The reason that the activity goes down is because MTHFR needs to bind to riboflavin or vitamin B2 in order to make the reaction happen, and that variant binds less to riboflavin, and so the riboflavin just tends to fall off the enzyme, and a higher concentration of riboflavin is needed to get normal enzyme activity. Now, if you look at where riboflavin is found in foods, the highest amounts of riboflavin are in foods that people don't really eat anymore. So like liver and heart and kidney are all really good sources of riboflavin. And then red meat and cheese and eggs and salmon are also good sources, but they're a couple steps down in the ladder. A lot of people don't eat red meat and cheese and eggs. A lot of people are trying to be healthy or avoiding them specifically to be healthy. So it's both the case that no one eats organ meats anymore because they don't want to. And then also, a lot of people don't eat much red meat, eggs, and cheese because they think it's bad to. So the intakes of riboflavin are a lot lower than they used to be. I think our ancestors ate a lot more riboflavin, and so I think it's quite possible that those polymorphisms are so common just because in the past they didn't decrease MTHFR activity that much because riboflavin status was high enough. And so that allowed them to spread. But now that riboflavin status is lower, those polymorphisms are essentially activated. Like now they do cause harm because the background stuff that they need to not cause harm isn't there.
Yeah.
And then in terms of why are we talking about it, we're just talking about it because more people know about it.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think I heard a stat that it sounds like you're saying the whole population has some kind of variation of it, but I heard a stat of 1 in 3 people have some kind of SNP in their MTHFR. I don't know if that's accurate now or
it's way high. No, it's way higher than that. 85% of people have at least one of them.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess the reason that we wanted to talk about
I don't. But so like 15% of people have neither of the two common SNPs, and then everyone else has at least one.
Okay.
And so if you have one of the weak one, it only decreases the activity by 17%, compared to 2 of the strong one decreases it by 75%.
Yeah.
So not that many people have 2 of the strong one, but it's, like I said before, it's very evenly spread across activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess the reason that we wanted to talk about it today is to bring people's awareness to it, because once you have a roadmap and you know, are you an under-methylator? Are you an over-methylator? Are there certain things you can do to enhance your health that you're then setting yourself up for success? So, you know, we want you guys, listeners, to take away from this that if you are expressing some of these symptoms, then it's worth kind of being aware of how you can go to Chris's protocol around methylation and kind of see where you're at and what you need to do to help yourself. Because as a personal example, I was an under-methylator, so I was the ruminator. I was very stable, very OCD, perfectionist, and in assisting myself through supplementation, through diet and lifestyle changes, yoga and meditation, just a lot of things that you can use to help yourself when you know what your roadmap is, I've become more flexible. Mm. So it's really cool to hear you talk about it from a very positive mindset of like stable versus flexible and kind of getting back to that equilibrium and then being able to choose which way you want to go when you need either of those options rather than feeling like you're stuck in the anxiety and depression or one or the other of those areas. So yeah, I really like the way you spoke about that.
Cool.
When it comes to taking like synthetic variations of the supplements that we need compared to, say, eating them from eating a variation of something like offal, what are the big differences? Is it more beneficial for us to be eating whole foods compared to just taking these supplements instead?
I think that we should always start with food, but I'm not against supplements. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, the supplement might actually literally be something different than what's in food. And that is the case with folic acid supplements. Mm-hmm. Folic acid is a synthetic form of folate that is not found in the food supply, except in trace quantities. Yeah. And it's metabolically, it is different. So like there's enzyme variations in the ability to utilize it, and it does require a little more stress on the system to use it. But there are also, you can also supplement with methylfolate or folinic acid, and those are forms of folate that are found in food. So that's sometimes one reason to favor food, but there are other reasons, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of like hard evidence around this. So, like some of this stuff, you have to be kind of like philosophically primed to think this way to adopt it, whereas other people might just be like, no, I'm just going to do it. There's evidence. So, like for example, there's no randomized controlled trial of comparing like liver, legumes, and leafy greens to the same amount of folate from a supplement.
Yeah.
But there's good reasons to not use supplements to replace a bad diet. So first of all, if you look at the history of nutrition, it's largely one of trying to do exactly that and then messing it up over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. So for example, in rats, they used to feed rats chow diets, which is like just cereal grains, basically. Yeah. And lab rats and lab mice are pretty well adapted to a diet of grains, and so it's pretty good. But then they said, like, look, these grains they're always something a little different. They're not standardized. We want to be able to compare cancer studies and like directly compare that guy's study to that guy's study, so we know how to compare the doses and stuff, and all the rats are eating exactly the same thing. So they came out with purified diets, chemically defined diets that were basically took all the components that they thought rats needed and put them all together. So it was done based on the science of the time. Then all the rats started getting fatty liver disease. They started getting bleeding disorders. All sorts of things happened. So then they came and they said, okay, we got to revise this. But they revised it. But then they still had problems. They revised it again. And then they still had problems. And then the last time they were like, screw it. We're going to put in everything that's in food. So like that now they put arsenic in the mineral mix because they were like, this is in food. Like we give up trying to know what the rat needs. We're just gonna like put everything conceivable basically they wound up replicating everything in food that they could, because every time they tried to figure out what was needed from food and supply it, they were wrong. And that was over the course of a century. And it's still the case that kind of on an anecdotal basis, a lot of researchers from around the transition periods, it generally seemed that the rats on the chow diets were more resilient to toxins and other insults that they would give them than rats on any of the updated versions of the defined diet. Then they did the same thing to humans with infant formula, and then they did it again to adults with total parenteral nutrition, or TPN, which is where they have chemically defined diets that are fed completely intravenously. So you can't eat anything because of some kind of severe obstruction or disease in your GI tract, and every nutrient you consume comes into your veins in TPN. In both infant formula and TPN, the history is basically the same. They're like, we know what humans need, and so they put together what humans need, and then the humans get some disease, and then they're like, oh damn, humans also need this thing. And so they did this. So like one of the stories from TPN is they realized that everyone on TPN was getting eczema. And so like the TPN didn't have enough zinc in it, and that's probably one of the things. And it was probably deficient in a couple other things, but the people who really had a lot of power at that point, or who stepped in at the right moment in time, were the essential fatty acid researchers, who said, there's no fat in this product. They're getting essential fatty acid deficiency. And all the research in essential fatty acids up to that point was basically 40 years that basically indicated that only omega-6 fatty acids are essential.
Ooh.
And so they developed two formulas for TPN. One had soybean oil and one had safflower oil. Soybean oil has an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of like something like 7-1 or something like that. And safflower oil has 140-1. Cool. So there's basically no omega-3 fatty acids in safflower oil, but who cares, because they're not essential. So in order to prevent them from getting eczema, they added safflower oil to the TPN. And so there was this girl who had a 6-year-old girl who had an abdominal gunshot wound, and she was on total parenteral nutrition for 6 months. And she gets this safflower oil formula. All of a sudden, she starts getting double vision and balance problems, just like severe neurological problems. And they switched her to the soybean oil formula, and everything went away. And that's when they decided that omega-3 fatty acids were essential nutrients in humans. Then the TPN did, but they didn't have any choline in the TPN. So this long-standing problem that everyone on TPN always gets fatty liver disease. And then in like the late 1990s, they were like, maybe everyone gets fatty liver disease because there's no choline. And so like the skeptics were like, no, choline deficiency causes fatty liver in animals. We've known that for like 50 years, but it doesn't cause, there's no evidence of that in humans. And so then some wise guy was like, whatever, I'm going to add choline to the TPN. And then the fatty liver went away.
Funny
and then, so in like 2000, it was declared that choline is an essential nutrient in humans, which, by the way, was one of the primary things that happened with the rats and mice that were put on the chemically defined diets, was that they all got fatty liver. And they put more choline in the thing and it went away, right? And so here it's happening to humans, and there's like skeptics who are like, no, that's not true in humans, come on.
And I just wanted to circle back when you were talking about omega-6 and omega-3 for the listeners. So omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory essential fatty acid, and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory as well.
That's a myth that came out of the 1990s view of inflammation. So now we know that omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory in some contexts, but they are critical to preventing inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract, and they are critical to resolving inflammation everywhere else. And
but you don't want to overdo them.
So the problem isn't really overdoing the omega-6. The problem is really that when you're completely reliant on plant oils, you have to synthesize animal forms of the essential fatty acids from the plant forms. And the synthetic machinery to do that is the same for omega-3 and omega-6. So if you don't, so the animal forms are arachidonic acid, which is the omega-6 fatty acid, and it's very abundant in liver and egg yolks. And then DHA, and some people would say EPA, but I focus on DHA, which is found in fatty fish, and also there's a vegan source in algae, and then also smaller amounts are found in egg yolks if the chickens are raised on pasture.
Yeah.
And they eat insects and grass. And so, but in the plant oils, so in soybean oil, you don't have any of those fatty acids. You have precursors of omega-3 and omega-6 that are pretty balanced. In the safflower oil, you have mostly the precursor to the omega-6. You don't have any precursor to omega-3. So this girl with the abdominal gunshot wound, she's not taking in any EPA or DHA or arachidonic acid, but she's taking in 140 times more omega-6 precursor than omega-3 precursor. So that precursor hogs the synthetic machinery and suppresses it from turning that little bit into DHA. And she also has body fat stores too, right? Like she probably has omega-3s in her adipose tissue that gets released, but they're not getting converted to DHA or to EPA because there's this massive influx of omega-6 precursors. But if you gave that girl a little bit of fish, none of that problem would have happened. So and I'm not saying like as long as you eat a little bit of fish, you're going to overdose all you want on vegetable oil. But the real issue of what happened to her isn't really that she got too much omega-6. It's that in the context of only getting the plant oils, the plant omega-6 was so overwhelming to the plant omega-3 that it just completely overwhelmed their ability to convert any plant omega-3 into the animal form.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, so with respect to inflammation, it's probably bad to totally overdo omega-6 or omega-3, but not having enough omega-3 is a lot more of a problem than having too much omega-6. And also people who take like NSAIDs, which are the over-the-counter anti-inflammatories like Tylenol and ibuprofen. Actually, Tylenol is not considered an NSAID, but it's still it may as well be for this purpose, and aspirin to some degree as well. Those all inhibit not only the ability of omega-6 to contribute to inflammation, but also the ability of omega-6 to resolve inflammation. And so they're kind of a recipe for chronic low-grade inflammation, because if you imagine inflammation going up like this and then coming down like this when it's over, you take the NSAID and maybe it goes to a lower peak inflammation, so it never gets as bad, but then never fully resolves and winds up here. Anyway, to go back to the point that you were originally asking, which is there any difference of getting methylation nutrients from food versus supplements? The thing is, like, I have a really good understanding of like what we know now about the components of the methylation system, but there's so many things in food that we don't understand that it's just always better to start with getting food and then use supplements. I mean, they're called supplements because they supplement the diet.
Yeah.
They're not called replacements. You don't say, "Oh, I'm going to go take my replacements." So, or substitutes. It's not a substitute for diet. I'm going to go take my substitute so I don't have to eat today. You say, "I'm going to take my supplements," right? So that the diet is the thing that you add a little bit to with the supplement, right? And so, yeah, the main reasons to go with food are that foods contain lots of things that we don't know that are probably important in the balance, and we don't want to neglect those things. And then also it's generally harder to overdose with food as well. And like certain things that have to be balanced are not necessarily in a perfect balance in every food, but they're never as out of balance as they can be when you're using supplements and you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great answer.
And I guess one of the things that people struggle to eat but probably should be eating more of is offal. That's something that you mentioned just before. But I think...
Well, it's awful. That's why.
But you do recommend a supplement that you've come across for that, because both Maddie and I have been listening to your podcast independently, and there was one that you recommended.
The ancestral...
I use ancestral liver capsules right now, and that's a good way to get liver in. That doesn't completely take care of all your methylation nutrients, but it covers the bases of, so like for liver, it's like it would probably be better to kill the cow yourself and take the fresh liver out and eat it right then. But none of us are going to do that, and so all of us will find some way to get somewhere on the spectrum deviating from that. And the liver capsules are great for people who really need the convenience of being able to take something out of the bottle without doing any food prep, and who really have a problem with the taste, and or people who really have a problem with the taste and need something where they really don't taste any of it at all. That's a good application for the capsules.
Okay, cool. And is there a specific population that should be taking them, or are they just good for everyone?
I think 4 to 8 ounces of liver a week, or a half ounce to an ounce of liver a day, is a great multivitamin for everyone.
Are there any suggestions or recommendations around pregnancy? Because I know they say be careful of taking too much vitamin A if you're pregnant, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so if you stick to that, you're going to be within the safe limit for vitamin A, even in pregnancy. In general, I think the studies on pregnancy and vitamin A and birth defects are not very convincing, but if you wanted to be very conservative, what you would say is, if you're of childbearing age and you think there's a chance you might get pregnant in the next year or two, don't supplement with doses of vitamin A higher than 10,000 IU a day of retinol unless you have a very strong reason to. And then when you are preparing for pregnancy, be especially careful not to go any higher than that. And then for the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, be especially careful not to go any higher than that.
It's so interesting that they've got all this information around those upper limits now. Because my mum was saying that she just ate liver all day, every day with all 4 of us, me and my siblings, and it wasn't really even on the radar.
Yeah, so I mean, there was one study that suggested that intakes over 10,000 IU were correlated with birth defects. And that one study got I don't remember how many, but it was something like 7, 8, 9 letters to the editor pointing out concerns about it and potential flaws in it. It's pretty rare that any study generates that many letters to the editor, and if it does, then it's pretty controversial. And that was the only prospective study. I think it was 1995 it came out. And it was the only prospective study, which is where they ask you what you're eating and then look at what happens later, as opposed to a cross-sectional study, which is where they just take everyone and look at asking questions about what happened in the past and what they ate in the past. And prospective studies are considered less biased because you're not going to give an answer based on what you think you did wrong to cause the birth defect. Because you don't know if you have birth defects yet or not. So there's nothing biasing your answer about what you're eating. And there were 7 or 8 other studies at the time that were all retrospective or cross-sectional, and none of them supported that one prospective study. So it was sort of like, is this one study an outlier because it's the only one that's high enough quality to assess the question, or is it an outlier because it's just wrong and everything else conflicts with it? Because the nature of statistics also is that you expect to find spurious findings occasionally. One of the criteria for deciding whether something is likely to be real or not is to use statistics to say, if this finding were not real, what are the chances that I would observe it anyway? And if you would observe it less than 5% of the time, were it not true, you say this is probably real. Right? So like you would expect if you do 100 studies on something to find 5 that are repeatedly finding this thing that's not true. And you know, if there's no effect of something, you'd expect some studies to find an effect and some studies to not find an effect, and you'd expect to kind of them cancel each other out. You wouldn't expect all the studies to find no effects, right? So if you have 8 studies on something and one finds one thing and 7 find the opposite, you have to consider the possibility that their method was different, therefore they got the right answer, but you also have to consider the possibility that it's just wrong, you know? And so the fact that there were like some large number of letters to the editor pointing out potential flaws and curious things that didn't make sense about the study is like, to me, but you know, since then they were like, if you eat vitamin A, you might get birth defects. And so like now that the recommendation is out there, you really can't study it anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because now the only people that are taking vitamin A are the people who don't listen to their doctor.
Yeah.
And so it's like you find something wrong with them, and it's like, is it because they don't listen to their doctor? Like, you know what I mean? And so it's like, yeah. So it's like once you have really strong recommendations, you kind of lose the ability to even guess that there might be true things out there that you're finding when you find correlations like that. And so, so it's just the data's messy. We'll never know. It is true that in animals, high doses of vitamin A cause birth defects, so it's plausible. But look, my perspective is there's not really any need to go above 10,000 IU of vitamin A for most women anyway.
Yeah.
And so and it's only relevant to the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And so just, you know, stick to it during times where you think you might get pregnant and through the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. But even then, that's equivalent to what you would get if you ate 8 ounces of liver a week.
Mm-hmm.
So it has no impact on what I was saying anyway.
Is there a difference in the quality of liver? So for instance, a pasture-raised cattle that you get the liver from compared to a factory farm cattle, has there been studies that show the difference between the two at all? Do you know?
I don't think there is any studies on the nutrient content of liver specifically between grass-fed and grain-fed cattle or between pasture-raised and factory-farmed cattle. But there are a number of studies on muscle meats, eggs, and dairy products. And we also know like what's in a grain diet and what's in grass. And based on that research, I would say it's pretty reliable inference that you're going to have higher folate levels and higher vitamin A levels and probably better nutrition in other ways too, and better omega-6, omega-3 ratios and things like that in liver from grass-fed cattle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Something I've heard you talking about previously is limiting protein for people who undermethylate. Can you talk a little bit more to that? Is it for people who undermethylate? I think that's what
1 gram per kilo of body weight rather than
overdosing or
yeah. So I don't like the term undermethylation and overmethylation because first of all, like I think if anyone is consistently overmethylating or undermethylating, it's probably not a sort of like permanent thing, but they're missing one thing on one side or the other of the system, and they just need to put everything in there, and they should achieve a balance.
Yeah. Okay.
And then also because you can simultaneously undermethylate one thing and overmethylate something else.
Yeah, makes sense.
Like it's completely possible for you to be undermethylating histamine and overmethylating dopamine at the same time, because there's other enzymes that are specific to dopamine and histamine and using the methyl groups, right? So I don't like to talk about it that way, but specifically people with low methylfolate production, so people with MTHFR fall into that category, have a tendency to. I should back up for a second. So glycine is an amino acid that is found in any protein and is especially rich in meat. In bones and connective tissue like tendons and skin.
Yeah.
And glycine is the buffer that prevents over methylation. And in when the system is working healthily and normally, you only methylate glycine when you have too many methyl groups. But for reasons that you probably don't want to go into, you need enough methylfolate to make that buffering system work properly. And when you don't have enough methylfolate, that buffering system operates when it should be shut off. In other words, even when you don't have enough methyl groups, you methylate glycine. And so that not only causes you to lose methyl groups, but it also causes you to lose glycine. Mm-hmm. And if you lose glycine, you lose your ability to buffer excess methyl groups, number one. You also lose positive benefits of glycine itself. Like, it's important for your skin health, your bone health, your blood sugar stability, your calmness, and your sleep. And so all those things can go wrong if you lose too much glycine. And too high of an intake of protein, especially animal protein, and especially eggs and dairy, to a lesser extent meat, will aggravate the loss of glycine. So I don't want to make a blanket statement to limit protein, but I think particularly if you haven't resolved the low methylfolate issues and the glycine levels, then I think you want to be careful about over consuming protein in that context.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's valid.
Yeah, definitely. SAMe is a product that occasionally gets used for, Stace got recommended to have SAMe, and it absolutely spun her backwards. Like, did not make any sense for her at all a week or two deep when she realized it was just affecting her in a negative way. I have heard you talk about this, but I can't verbalize it at all. I just know that there's sometimes it is positive, sometimes it is negative when you do have an MTHFR. Can you dive into that anymore?
So what happened to you when you took it?
It sent all my symptoms back. I was kind of on a path to improving, getting my anxiety and depression under control, and then
got more aggravated, really.
Yeah, everything just went a bit skew with the mental health stuff, and I was I've got low zinc as well, just generally as part of all this, but gum issues, like how you were saying with your teeth. I've never had cavities or anything, but getting kind of bleeding gums and just like low energy, and I guess all the symptoms came back.
Yeah. So the first thing is that SAMe is an activated form of methionine, which is an amino acid that is found in all proteins and is especially rich in animal protein. And the reason that I was just singling out the eggs and dairy and then the meat after that is because they're higher in methionine. And methionine is the thing that depletes the glycine. And specifically, SAMe is the activated form of methionine that will deplete the glycine. So everything that I just said about over-consuming protein is all identically applies to taking SAMe. Okay. But it's also the case, I think, that for some people, if they're chronically exposed to low methylation state, they will kind of turn up the volume on a lot of the enzymes that need methyl groups to try to fight for those methyl groups. It's sort of like if people are listening to your podcast and you accidentally made the volume really low, everyone's going to turn up the volume to high because they're struggling to hear it. But then if halfway through the podcast you fix the volume issue and you didn't warn them, then all of a sudden they're going to need like ear surgery or something because their volume was turned up all the way high and then you blasted it on them, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like that. Like you may have adaptations where you're like, oh, methyl supply on a scale of 1 to 10 is at 1 right now. I need to turn up the volume on this enzyme to 100. And then all of a sudden you put SAMe into the system and methyl supply is now at 10 out of 10. And so that 100 is now like 1,000. And you're like, oh, I never wanted it that high. So I think that can also be a problem. And I think that's also plays into some people with methylfolate have the same thing. Like they take methylfolate and they're like, why does this make me angry? So I think it could be either or, and it could also be a combination of those two things.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
And they would tend to aggravate each other too, because if you're losing more glycine, you are losing your buffer against overmethylation. And so that can aggravate the fact that you are overmethylating at that point as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, we're pretty close on the hour now, Chris, so we might start to wrap it up. I'd like to point people back to your website, which is chrismasterjohnphd.com. I feel like there's so much content and insight on there that's available for free for individuals, in particular your vitamins and minerals 101 course that they can do. It's 30 days of content straight to your email or straight to your messenger on Facebook, and you guys just get, like, it's literally just like a little read up each day, which is absolutely super insightful. So I think that's probably a really good place to start. Also, I believe it's chrismasterjohnphd.com/methylation is a really good insight to kind of everything we've talked about today as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think for people specifically interested in this content, the methylation page, chrismasterjohnphd.com/methylation is a great place to kind of get a little bit more detail and context on specifically the methylation issues. I think the Vitamins and Mineral 101 course is a great way to put the methylation nutrients into the context of all the other nutrients. And then I do also have Testing Nutritional Status, the Ultimate Cheat Sheet, which is not free. It's $30, but I can hook your audience up with a 20% discount on that.
Oh, thanks.
And that is great for people who want to take more of a proactive management thing. So people who don't necessarily want to learn about this, but want to take care of it. That's where that comes in, because it helps you use blood work and dietary analysis and stuff like that to manage the practical side.
So it's more individualized.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Awesome.
That is amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris.
Thank you.
I love geeking out on this stuff. Being a dietitian, I love talking about it all day, but we should probably let you get on with your life.
Your night as well. What about on socials?
I'll let you get along with yours.
Yeah, you're quite active
so-
on YouTube and Instagram and stuff like that. So yeah, what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are where I'm most active, and that's just at Chris Masterjohn, spelled just like my name.
Unreal. Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank
Been
you.
a ball.
Cool. Thank you.
Visit thechieflife.com for all of your nutrition coaching needs, your own personalized meal plan, as well as how you can get involved with one of our 7-pillar retreats.